Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed your lunch. It was free. It was good and it was free. Two wonderful qualities, good and free. We're getting ready for our last panel, but to introduce it is actually a member of that panel who's going to give a short PowerPoint with some very interesting political stats. And this is a good friend of the Center for Politics, Glen Bolger, taught his daughter here. He's one of the Republican Party's leading political strategists and pollsters, a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies. And I'll just add this, I don't want to cover what Susan's going to cover when she gives you her full introduction, but we went to Glen when we wanted to understand the Trump voter better. And he helped us put together a wonderful plan of both polling, a pretty large sample, and doing 5 focus groups in key states that put Trump over the top. And they were only Trump people mainly. I think there were a couple people slipped in there somehow, independents or whatever. But it was mainly Trump people talking because you have to get the other people out of the room before they'll tell you what they really think. Sometimes, you know, it was tough to hear, but it was useful, and we got a lot out of that study, and we appreciate it very much, and it was Glen's expertise that made it happen. So again, you'll get a fuller introduction for him once the panel begins, but I want to bring up Glen to do his PowerPoint. Thanks, Glen.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always great to speak here at the American Democracy Conference. The team of people at the Center for Politics is one of the top-notch analytical teams anywhere to be found in the country. So just being invited by them is quite an honor. Although I will say, I went earlier this week, I think it was Tuesday, I went online to just kind of double-check the schedule. And for my time, for this presentation, it was listed as going from 1:15 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. So, well, that's going to be my first 12-hour and 15-minute presentation. Let me assure you, by the way, Alumni Hall at 1 a.m. is locked up nice and tight. So I went back, slept in my car, and then edited my 20,000-page presentation down to 28 or so. Anyhow, it is good to be here. No, I obviously kind of figured out the mistake. It is without further ado that I get to, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in 2016, or I shouldn't say what happened, you know what happened, but some of the root causes of what happened in 2016, and then focus on 2018, which as a Republican, it does not warm the cockles of my heart, but data is what the data is. So I want to talk about what I see as the 4 keys to the rise of Trump in 2016. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the more interesting findings from the Trump voter focus groups and survey. But in terms of the 4 keys to his rise in 2016, one was an economic hollowing out. If you look, the net worth families in the country has fallen sharply over the past decade. Look at 2007, for instance. The median net worth of families in 2014 dollars was basically $138,000. Well, after the recession hit, that net worth dropped significantly. So big economic drop. Also an epic fail in terms of the loss of faith in American institutions. Gallup does this great series every year, once a year, where they ask how much confidence they have in a number of institutions. And by the way, some of the institutions, you'll note different years after that. That's when they first started asking the questions. But they really started, most of them, in 1985. They had asked about the presidency back in 1975. I have no idea why they would pick that question, that time frame. And then you've noticed they've added some more on. But look at, besides the military and a few others, there's been double-digit drops in, and let's start with it. Big business dropped 14 points over the last essentially 30 years. Newspapers dropped 15 points. The presidency, U.S. public schools, the Supreme Court, banks, television news, the church and organized religion, and U.S. Congress. And you say, wow, it's not surprising U.S. Congress is at the bottom of the list. Well, the flip side of it is it's a little surprising they had that far to drop. even back in 1985. And then the third, sorry, I got to figure out where to point it. It's a well-earned anger at Washington. One of the questions that Pew Research has been asking for a long time, and before that it was Gallup data as well. How much do you trust the government, or what percent trust the government always or most of the time? You can see it's basically bottomed out right around 19-20%, pretty consistently over the last 7 or 8 years or so. So a big drop in that. And then a rise in anti-establishment sentiment as well, particularly among Republican primary voters. When you look at from 16 key states there on the left, would you say that you feel betrayed by politicians from the Republican Party? You've got 55% in those exit polls. So these were primary voters who said, yes, they felt betrayed by the Republican Party. And that is anger, why you see a lot of Republican-based anger directed at people like Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Marco Rubio, others who ran for president, Jeb Bush. And then even in the Democratic primary, as late as May, Bernie Sanders was only 8 points behind in a national matchup on who Democratic primary voters would vote for, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. Now moving ahead to right now, one of the things that we are seeing on the big picture is that we are seeing big changes in party ID. There are more Democrats in the country than there are Republicans. That's been very consistent over time. Only occasionally has Republicans caught up. But what's really important is what's happening underneath, which is what groups in the last 7 years, since 2010, which was the big Republican comeback after 2006 and 2008, what groups have moved and become more Republican, what groups have moved and become more Democratic. And some of them are boxed or circled. Those are groups that in 2010 were more, the boxes meant there were more Democrats among them than Republicans in terms of who they identify with. If it's circled, back in 2010, that meant they were more Republican than Democratic. So these groups have made huge shifts. And this is not just one survey. These are national merges. One of my partners does the polling, the Republican half of the NBC Wall Street Journal polling team. So what they do is they merge the data, thousands of interviews together from an entire year, and look at the shifts. 2017, it was the 6 months of monthly polls. But look, older voters have gone from Democratic to Republican, those aged 50 plus. Also, whites in the Northeast have gone Republican, and then voters with lower levels of education, those with a high school degree or less, and men without a college degree. And that's different because you could have gone to 1 or 2 years of college, not gotten your degree, and that's a pretty sizable chunk of the American population, actually. And then middle income, 50 to 75,000, have gone from Democrat to Republican. Those who've moved from Republican to Democrat, if you look on the blue side, college graduates, men who have a college degree or more, in other words, postgraduate degree, whites with a college degree or more, and then those upper income, earning more than $75,000. The other groups have become more on the left, well, left as you're looking at it, not politically, but in the red side, those other groups have become more Republican, and the groups on the blue side that aren't circled, those groups have become more Democratic since 2017. So you're seeing a widening of polarization, big shifts, and you saw it writ large here in the Virginia gubernatorial election as well, that Senator Kaine was talking about. Moving on to President Trump. Look, data and history really is cool stuff to look at. And this is a fun chart, unless you, I guess, are a Donald Trump political advisor. This shows about 10 months into the presidency, every president's average approval rating or approval rating. So JFK, who I know Professor Sabato really cares a lot about, he was at 76% in October of 1961. And President Bush, W. Bush, obviously, after 9/11, was at 82%. You can see we had 5 presidents over 60%. Then we had another 4 in the low 50s, including both Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, neither of which, had tough re-election campaigns. Obama, obviously, more so than Reagan, who won 49 states. Also Jimmy Carter. So, kind of doesn't matter what neighborhood you start out in terms of where you finish. But you can see President Trump lower than Jerry Ford, who that was after his pardon of Nixon, but higher than Truman, who, of course, Truman bounced back and won re-election. So 10 months in doesn't necessarily define where you are, but it does help define your political capital. Now, what's interesting when you look at the president's approval rating among Republican CDs, he's upside down now. And this is the first time that has happened in a long time. His approval rating in Republican-held districts is 45%. In Democratic districts, not surprisingly, much lower at 30%, including 66% who disapprove. Now, in the safe Republican districts, his approval rating is 56-37. So if the Democrats do take control of the House back, it's going to come in those marginal seats, those marginal Republican seats. They're not going to make a lot of gains in the safe Republican seats. Now we're going to go to the Trump focus groups and Trump voter survey. This was done back in April, right around the time of the 100-day mark. We did have some focus groups among Republicans and independents who did not vote for Trump. Larry, we did 10 groups, not 5. When you're basically running the University of Virginia like Larry is, you're not going to remember every detail, so don't hold it against him. But when we ask people, the Trump voters, why they approve of him, this is something for people need to understand how supportive his base is. The top quote, for instance, I know it's hard to read, so I'm going to read some of it to you. He said he was going to do something, and he took immediate action, not, we're going to go transition and everything. He hit the ground running. He went to work right away. On the left there, in the orange, I hope you guys like the color scheme, making things happen right away and not wasting any time dragging his feet. To his right, I think we needed some definite leadership that wasn't an attorney or wasn't a career politician, but was a businessman. At the bottom, Trump had his finger on the pulse of what folks in Scioto County, which is a key rural county in Ohio, which obviously is a key state, other parts who were unemployed, struggling with all sorts of things. Trump had a better sense of how to reach those people and connect with them in a way that Romney never really was able to do it. Well, one of the projective exercises, and you'll find this pretty interesting, we asked it both of Trump's supporters, who you're going to see first, and then the people who are not fans of Trump, and that is, and they write this down on in their little book, and then we collect it. And the question is, if Donald Trump were an animal, what kind of animal would he be and why? And among his supporters, the number one thing, 19 people in the groups mentioned it: a lion, king of the jungle, assertive, powerful leader, hear the roar, clever, fierce, unafraid, standing up for his people, protector, tiger, strong, independent, fierce, protective, instinct, rushing around, sneaky at times, dog, mood changes, unpredictable, aggressive, act without thinking, guarding the home front. By the way, the act without thinking, even Trump voters back then were sick of his Twitter, by the way. Elephant and badger. And then among those who were not Trump fans, those who were Trump opponents, there were, we did only a couple of groups with them, but, elephant, if it bothered you, it can kill you, or if bothered, it can kill you. When angered, causes damage. Snake, slimy, mean, eats other animals, can't trust the poisonous ones. I'm having water. It's something I do. It's not a political statement. Bull, he's a bully, it's stubborn, runs around with his head down, does whatever he wants. Lion, so there were some positives, but somewhat abrasive. And weasel, which, as you might think, is not a positive, smirky, selfish, small-minded, sneaky. Now, in terms of, we asked a lot of questions on the survey, but I only had originally 15 minutes. I may take 20 just because we have the time. But among Trump supporters on the survey, this was 1,000 Trump supporters in key states. Excuse me. We looked at the images among different Democrats, among these Trump supporters. And when you look at Biden and Bernie Sanders, you say, well, look, their unfavorables, Glen, they're in the 60s. I don't know what you mean. You know, their favorables are only 20%. But think about how close Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were. 100,000 votes among the three of them. So, you know, it is, you know, would one of them have won? Would one of them have picked up some support among Trump supporters and over, you know, people who ultimately voted for Trump? Would they overcome that? You know, I don't know, but as a Republican, it's one of the few fun things I get to raise about 2016. We also did what's called a mind map, where people start out with a blank page with nothing in it. Well, not totally blank, because in the middle of it is a circle with the name of whatever it is you want them to be thinking about. And in this case, it's Donald Trump. And if you look to the top right, it says confident, powerfuful leader. That showed up on 31 of, I want to say we had about 80 people in the group, the Trump supporter groups combined. It may have been 70. I'd have to go back and look. And so that was the most mentions. And then all the way over to the left, they also said successful businessman, also in double digits, family, change Washington, obnoxious, loud, straight shooter, outspoken. Not, you know, and a lot of positive things. Not everything's positive. You'll note 6 people mentioned bad hair. You know, when we did those, I will say this, I was part of the super PAC team that tried to help Mitt Romney become president. Bad hair never came up for either candidate on that one. And then among the people who were not Trump voters, what they thought of him, the number one thing, again, the number is lower because we had fewer people in each group, but selfish ego, you know, his ego. Bottom right, bigot, racist, also in double digits. To the left there, poor demeanor to aggressive, Twitter, also orange and bad hair, so the groups had that in common. Businessman, you know, so not everything even among them is necessarily a negative. And also on the poll, we asked Trump, going back from the focus groups back to the poll now, we asked Trump voters, was your vote more for Donald Trump or against Hillary Clinton? Or more against Hillary Clinton. 57% of Trump voters said it was for Donald Trump. 43% said it was against Hillary Clinton. And these groups here on the left side, under for Trump, these are the ones who were more inclined to say, look, my votes were for Donald Trump. You know, I really backed what he was saying. And you can see men 18 to 54, voters that lived in the Trump-Obama states, you know, they went Obama in 12, Trump in 16, very conservative voters. I was a little surprised to see moderate liberal Republicans down there as well, but also Trump-Obama voters, people who strongly favored the Tea Party, those with a high school degree or less, and then against Clinton tended to be more swingy type voters, soft Republicans, independents, voters in consistently Republican states, in other words, Trump-Romney states, younger women who voted for Trump, older men who voted for Trump. So it's somewhat conservative voters. So a little bit more swingy, but not entirely. Now, turning to 2018, just a couple of 3 big picture slides here. This is one of my, in 2010 and 2014, this was one of my favorite slides. In 2018, it's going to be one of my least favorite slides. And what this does is this looks at midterm elections. The line is the president's approval rating going into that election, in October of that election. And then the bars are the number of seats won or lost by the president's own party in the House. So, for example, in 1966, LBJ's approval rating was 49%. Democrats lost 47 seats. In 2010, it was 45% approval for President Obama. Democrats lost 63 seats. 4 years earlier, it was George W. Bush's second midterm. He had a 39% approval rating. Republicans lost 30 seats. So if you look at the box on the top right, it says job approval on average when the president's job approval is over 60%, his party in a midterm election picks up an average of just 3 seats. There's not a whole huge upside to being the party in the White House when there's an election coming, a midterm election. Even 50 to 60%, a positive approval rating, you tend to lose seats, an average of 12 seats. But when it drops under 50, that's when the bottom drops out, an average of 40-seat loss. And that is, extremely concerning to Republicans looking at 2018. And then another thing, by the way, that you hear about elections is midterm elections the independent voters don't matter. Only the base matters. Base turnout is what matters. Well, I've got data to say that's hogwash. They may not turn out quite the same levels as they do in a presidential election. And by turnout, I mean as a percent of the electorate. Everybody in a midterm, everybody's vote drops. There are fewer Republicans who vote. There are fewer Democrats who vote. There are certainly fewer independents. But a share of the electorate, yeah, independents drop a bit. But in 2006, in the generic ballot, when Democrats won 30 seats from Republicans, Democrats were winning among in the exit polls by 18 points among independents. In 2010, they literally flipped. They went from minus 18 to plus 19 for Republicans in 2010, when, again, Republicans won 63 seats. In 2014, not quite as much. Of course, there weren't as many seats, but Republicans won independents by 12 points and picked up 13 more seats. So anybody who tries to tell you that independents don't matter, only the base matters, yes, base turnout is important and can make the difference. But you cannot win on turnout what you've already lost on message. If you lose on message, remember in 2010, that's when I coined this phrase, and I'm so happy because I feel like Larry Sabato because it shows up in quotes every midterm election. People bring it back, journalists bring it back, and boy, they are smart. And that, if you've lost it on message, doesn't matter how. If you remember, in 2010, the Democrats were saying, look, we know it's a tough year for us, but we're going to do well because we have the technology, we have the databases, we have all these things to get our vote out. And you know what? They had all those things and it didn't work. So, you do need motivation and momentum as well as a great turnout program. So finally, the last 2 slides have been kind of grim for my side. Oh, and by the way, as you'll note, right now, Democrats have an 8-point advantage among independents on the generic ballot. Obviously we're a year out from the election. Lots can change, so we'll be tracking that with interest. But right now, when you look at the generic ballot in Republican congressional districts, that has dropped to just a 6-point lead. Remember, out of the Republican-held districts, the generic Republican is only up 6 points. You look at 2010 up by 15. Then, whereas Democrats, they're running not surprisingly, running very strong in their own districts. They're up by 25 points. So Republicans are still ahead in Republican districts, but it is getting closer to, wow, some of these are going to be battlegrounds. And keep in mind, some of those seats are extraordinarily safe. So that +6 means that in some Republican seats, we're actually behind on the generic ballot. And the generic ballot is, if the election for Congress were being held today, would you vote for, and the next 2 are rotated, but would you vote for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate for Congress in this district? So that's why it's called generic ballot, because no names are used, just the 2-party labels. So with that, I'd like to, thank you and invite the rest of the next panel up here with me.
Good job. That was very interesting. You really covered the waterfront. Glen, let me thank you very much. I just told him he covered the waterfront. That was very interesting. Glen is obviously a Republican pollster, but we have always found him to be incredibly blunt and truthful. And by the way, Glen, you're absolutely right. We had 10 focus groups. I remember that. We paid for them. But
Yes.
but when I said 5, it's just an alternate fact. That's the way things work today. You know, you say 10, I say 5. Let's compromise at 7.5. All right? But no, it's a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Now, it is my great pleasure. Oh, my goodness, you don't even have a seat, so I'll get out of your way here. But my great pleasure to introduce Susan Page, who will be chairing this terrific panel, and we're looking forward to it, although I've been told Bakari Sellers is very angry about some things and probably will just get up and he'll say, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. He's going to leave around 2:10. He's already planned this thing. So I just want you to know that. Trying to cover for him. Okay. Susan, everybody knows Susan Page. I can't imagine anybody in the room does not know Susan Page. She has covered 6 White House administrations, 10 presidential elections. You're much too young. No way. No way that could have happened. And interviewed the past 9 presidents. She founded and hosts an award-winning video newsmaker series for USA Today called Capitol Download, which is a lot of fun. You should see it. She appears often on cable news shows. I don't think there is a Sunday show that I don't see you on. I mean, I'm in that habit where, you know, I even get up early, watch Inside Politics. That's how sick I am. On Sunday morning, 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, I'm watching Inside Politics. But you're on, I saw you recently, I think on CBS, Face the Nation and Meet the Press and the whole bunch of them. So it's wonderful that she is able to take time for us because she is extremely busy. So many things she's accomplished in her career. She was president of the White House Correspondents Association, which, of course, gave Donald Trump his start as a presidential candidate when President Obama attacked him, if you'll remember at that, I guess it was 2011. She has been chairman of the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Awards. She's twice been a juror for the Pulitzer Prizes. I found this interesting. I didn't realize you were a native of Wichita, Kansas. What in the hell is the matter with Kansas? I think that'd make a good book. What's the matter with Kansas? She's a 1973 graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, which is terrific. We hear from a lot of their students even today. She was editor-in-chief of the Daily Northwestern when she was in college, and she has a master's degree from Columbia University, where she was a Pulitzer Fellow. It is really my pleasure to not only introduce her as chair, but to thank her and her panel members so much for making the trip to Charlottesville. We thank you so much. Have a great panel.
Good afternoon. I actually came for the free lunch. I want to just briefly introduce this really fantastic group of political experts and analysts that we have here. Glen Bolger, you just heard from, partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies. He's helped elect 13 senators, 6 governors, more than 65 members of Congress. And next to him is Bakari Sellers, who was born and raised in Denmark. Little known fact, that would be Denmark, South Carolina.
Oh, correct.
When he was 21, he was elected to the South Carolina state legislature. He ran for lieutenant governor and is often seen talking about politics on cable TV himself. Next to him is Mark Mellman, who is CEO of the Mellman Group, and his numbers would be helping elect 16 senators, 8 governors, and over 24 members of Congress. So that means between them, our 2 pollsters have elected 29 senators, 14 governors, and 90 members of the House. So practically a caucus among yourselves. And next to Mark is Paul Singer, Congress and Politics Editor at USA Today, and my colleague there, where his numbers would be that he helps direct coverage of Congress and politics for USA Today and for the 109 newspapers who make up the USA Today network. So it's quite a lot of history and expertise here. So they have guaranteed that at the point that Bakari has to leave the panel to catch a plane, they will each tell us who the nominees are going to be in 2020. with the understanding that only a coward would try to dodge this question. Glen, I want to start with you. First talk about Republicans in 2020. President Trump announced he was running for re-election the day he was inaugurated for his first term. He's been raising money for his re-election committee, so I'm pretty clear he plans to run. Will he be challenged for the Republican nomination?
I think it's quite likely that he will. The question is whether it's a serious challenge or not. I mean, you know, it's very obviously extraordinarily important office, and a lot of people think they can do it well. Whether he will, whether that person can raise money, organize, it's very, very difficult to take on an incumbent president within your own party. So I'm skeptical that that a challenge would get very far.
Who do you think are the likely suspects to challenge?
I don't think that those people have even kind of made up their minds yet, and I think somebody. Obviously a more establishment type of figure, and you said you would only call us a coward if we didn't answer who the Democratic nominee would be.
No, not true. Untrue. Play the tape. You think Trump will be the nominee?
I do, yes.
Let's do Republicans now. We'll do Democrats later. Who do you think the Republican nominee will be in 2020?
So I'm gonna fly out on this limb and probably get laughed at by the people who are smarter than I. But I think that the Republican nominee in 2020 will be Nikki Haley.
I agree.
Oh.
I agree. Exactly.
So, please explain.
Are you also
Well,
from South
I
Carolina?
honestly don't believe that Donald Trump will run for re-election. We can talk about psychopathy, et cetera, but I don't think he's going to run for re-election. I think that there's going to be a robust but quick primary, which will include the Flakes and the Kasichs and the Ted Cruzes and the Marco Rubios, but we're looking for a fresh face, somebody who has a dose of experience, somebody who's talented, somebody who is female, minority, and I think that Nikki Haley checks a lot of those boxes. And I think that if Nikki Haley's not president or candidate for president in 2020, she definitely will be in 2024.
So, Mark Mellon, who will be the Republican nominee in 2020?
Well, I think it's extremely likely to be Donald Trump. That is, assuming he's running. I do assume he's running, both because of his current activities, but also I think unless he is able to bring peace in the Middle East, denuclearize North Korea, et cetera, if he does those things, I think he'll be able to say, I've done more in my 4 years than any president has ever done. And he'll be very happy with that. But short of those kinds of accomplishments, I think he's going to feel that he needs to stay on to do even more things, bad as they may be, from my perspective. But in any event, I think he's going to run. I think there will be someone challenging him, John Kasich, perhaps others. And I think it's also very likely that he will beat them. I think it's even more likely that he is the nominee if he runs than that he runs for re-election.
I agree that Nikki Haley is the most likely, but my second backup is Mike Pence. I don't think that Donald Trump's going to run for re-election in part because I think he's going to discover, and he's already discovering, that it's no fun. The job is no fun. The good stuff, like going to China and getting the red carpet and flying on the big airplane, you really only get to do once or twice, and you've already done that. It's fun, and I just think he's going to just decide it's no fun and let Mike Pence be the nominee.
So can I just add one more time? One thing that Trump is doing in violating sort of basic norms of all kinds of basic norms, but one of the basic norms he's violating is with these continued calls for investigations of Hillary Clinton. And the truth is, if he, by virtue of having violated that norm, if he does not run for re-election and a Democrat wins, he is going to be investigated for the rest of his life. Okay, so it is really very much going to be in his interest to continue running as long as he can. At present, the Constitution limits that to just one more 4-year term. But if he doesn't do that and a Democrat wins, he's going to be facing investigations till the day he dies, because there's a lot more to investigate there than there is about Hillary Clinton or anyone else.
Glen, what do you think about that?
I do think that there's a chance, touching on what Paul said, that Trump could get bored and not run for re-election, in which case I do think the most likely nominee would be Mike Pence. But I will say Nikki Haley would be a very intriguing nominee.
You know, he has, President Trump has redefined the Republican Party in some big ways. Does that prevail post-Trump, whenever that is, whether it's 2020 or 2024, or has he permanently changed what the Republican Party stands for?
Well, don't take this the wrong way, folks. You guys are all wonderful, but if I could predict the future, I'd be in Vegas betting on sports. But look, I think that Trump is a unique figure in American politics, and the Republicans were so disappointed by Mitt Romney's loss that they opted for somebody who was not part of the establishment, not a politician, and that's the main reason Trump did so well. If Trump loses in 2020 or kind of flames out, I think that that's more likely to encourage a kind of revert to the norm, the Republican normality.
So it springs back like a rubber band, like stretched this way for Trump, but then it goes back to what it was before when he's off the scene?
Yes.
Do the rest of you think that's true? That's Trump specific?
Yes, I think that what Trump has, nobody else can coddle together. I mean, it's like Trump, it's Trumpism. And either that Trumpism wins or that Trumpism doesn't. Like, the perfect example is here in Virginia. Like, you can't take an Enron exec, like chair of the RNC, moderate establishment Republican, and fit him into Trumpism. It just doesn't work. Either that has to be you or it's not you. And so I think that it's going to rise and fall with the man. And, some Republicans are going to try to utilize that, and some will be successful, but I think the overwhelming majority who don't run as themselves won't be.
So, Mark, among your, how many members of the Senate have you helped elect? I just said 18, 16. How many of them are running for president next in 2020?
Almost none of them, to my knowledge.
Yeah.
Almost none.
Well, but talking more generally about the Democratic Party, what's the race going to look like in 2020? It seems like there are an awful, as Glen was pointing out, an awful lot of Democrats who are interested in the race.
Yeah, no, it's going to be, I think, a very crowded field. Roll back half step. The truth is, it's a year that shouldn't be that good for Democrats by rights. That is, historically, only once since World War II has a candidate been defeated running for a second party term. That was Jimmy Carter running for a second party term. Someone say, wait a minute, George Bush the father. No, he was running for a fourth party term when he was defeated, 2 terms of Ronald Reagan and 1 term of his own. Only once has someone been defeated running for a second party term, which is what Trump would be doing. So you would think people in the normal course of events would sit back and say, probably not going to happen, not worth that much time and effort. On the other hand, as Glen was suggesting, this is the most unpopular president we've ever had. He keeps setting records. He was the most unpopular president we ever had at inauguration, the most unpopular president in 100 days, the most unpopular president today. My guess is when we get a year out.
Actually, Truman was 4 points lower.
Okay, sorry, not today. Last week, he would be most unpopular.
Have you been waiting to use that?
For today. It's good today only. No. And my guess is he'll be the most unpopular president when we get to the midterm, so on. So the truth is, I think Democrats are looking at this and saying this is a realistic opportunity to win the White House. Very realistic opportunity. Second, there is no presumptive Democratic nominee. I mean, if you looked last cycle, everybody thought, rightly as it turned out, that Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee. And only people who really who didn't care about their likelihood of winning, like Bernie Sanders, were willing to jump in and run against her. There is not that presumptive nominee this year. And the truth is, all the people that will be consider running, and all the people that will be running will be largely people no one has ever heard of outside their own constituencies.
People like
Eric Garcetti, who's mentioned.
Hey, you can't take my thunder.
I'm sorry.
You're in the green room.
He was in the green room.
I didn't mean to take your as an example. There's nobody outside of Los Angeles who knows who Eric Garcetti is. There's nobody outside of New York who knows who Kirsten Gillibrand is. There's nobody outside of Minnesota who knows Amy Klobuchar. These are people who are well known in their own constituencies, all of whom are considering running, many, many more. But none of them are known to almost anyone outside their own constituency.
Of course, so someone could say at this point, 4 years ago, nobody would have said Donald Trump was going to be president. 8 years before that, no one would have said Barack Obama is going to be the president. So that should encourage people in that kind of
I'm not saying that's a negative. I'm just saying you're going to have a lot of people out there who no one has ever heard of, and they're going to be competing, and one of them will win. Will win the nomination, and that person, when they win that nomination, will be a superstar, like most nominees are, at least for a while. And they do have an excellent chance of beating Donald Trump.
Paul, when you're up on the Hill, what's your sense of things in terms of members of Congress, especially in the Senate, but maybe also a few in the House, about how many Democrats are looking at 2020 as a prospect?
All of them. I mean, I think, well, first of all, there is a Democratic frontrunner now. It's John Delaney, the congressman from Maryland, who's the only one who's actually declared his presidential candidacy for 2020. So there's that. The challenge for any of these people is that they are tied to Congress, which used to be a good thing. Like it used to be, well, I was a member of Congress. I had some experience. I had some skills. I had some background. That's now increasingly, particularly in the Republican Party, being seen as, the most negative there is. For the Democratic Party, I think there's some candidates who will be able to use their opposition status in the Senate particularly to make the point that they are the anti-Trump candidate that we need. So whether that is, I'm not going to give away some of my nominee suggestions, but someone like Klobuchar is a great example who can quietly but solidly build a record of opposing everything Donald Trump has ever said, which is good for the Democrats. Like they like that stuff. But I also will say, for what it's worth, that you bring up Barack Obama as a good example of someone no one ever heard of. I mean, here's an example for you, right? You've got Barack Obama, a guy no one's ever heard of. He's running in a crowded Democratic primary. He wins a divided party with a lot of support from a civil rights background and African-American voters. He is running against a Republican whose campaign craters because of a sex scandal, and he waltzes into the Senate, and 4 years later becomes president of the United States, right? Well, in that case, I'm picking Doug Jones.
Hey, speaking of Doug Jones, raise your hands if you think Doug Jones is going to win the Senate race. And raise your hand if you think that Roy Moore is going to win. And Glen?
Coward.
I'm a coward. I think Jones will win.
So 3 for Jones. Wow.
I think another Republican's going to get on the ballot and divide that. Or not get on the ballot, but run as a write-in. Even if it's a Democratic dog that they put in and call a Republican, they're gonna cut off enough votes from Moore that Jones will be able to win. That's my hypothesis.
It's interesting that even though Roy Moore could not be more embattled as a candidate, and I have to say that I had her mother's permission does not strike me as the strongest defense in this kind of case, that people are still not 100% certain that he's going to lose.
Because it's Alabama. Okay. When you're running in the deep South, we're not talking about Virginia, we're not talking about Florida, we're talking about Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina to a certain extent, unless you're running against a senator who got caught up in a prostitution ring and you're running for governor in Louisiana. These things matter. And so a normal, and the pollsters can tell you this, a normal plateau for Doug Jones running for office is between 38 and 42%. If he gets 42%, he ran the best campaign he can possibly run in the state of Alabama. Even with all of this going on, I mean, to get from 42% to 50% if there are only 2 candidates, or 50% plus 1 vote, that's a lot. I mean, that's either a lot of people staying home or you betting, because you've maxed out Democratic potential, you betting that that's a lot of Republicans. I mean,
I think Jones is going to win by a big margin.
Well, and you know what this reminds me of? I'm so hopeful. I really hope that happens. You know what this reminds me of at the same time? Access Hollywood came out at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Access Hollywood came out at the same time during Donald Trump's race for president. And everybody was jumping off. I mean, his future chief of staff even went to Trump Tower and told him to get out the race. Now, I don't know if we'll have a Comey moment, but there still is a very long period of time for Republicans to come home. And I'm just not ready to bet on Doug just yet. And I love him. I mean, I think you have somebody who's been accused of some horrible stuff versus somebody who prosecuted the person who blew up the 16th Street Baptist Church. I mean, there's been no clear dichotomy in the history of American politics.
Let's never forget what happened on that one day during the campaign, because I'll never forget. Access Hollywood tape That was the day that the intelligence community announced that they agreed.
And Podesta's emails were leaked.
That's the day the intelligence community agreed that there was Russian hacking of our election, and the WikiLeaks disclosures began to flood out. That was, I have to say, quite the news day, and I'm relieved to be here and away from that for at least an afternoon, because it has been quite the year for news.
I'm sorry, can I add something on the Democrats?
But first you have to answer why you think he's going to win. Doug Jones is going to win by a big margin.
Well, because if you look at the general trend in the polls, Jones has the momentum and Moore's dropping like a stone. Yeah. And there's not too many people who have daughters who think it would be wonderful for a 32-year-old or however early 30s to be dating a 14-year-old. That's just not. I don't care what state it is.
Yeah.
But on the Democratic, I went through Democratic presidential process. I went through 4 articles, one from The Hill, one from Washington Post, Politico, CBS News, that all listed various potential Democratic candidates. 34 names were listed. Now, after today's news, one of them was Al Franken, so it's probably 33. 28 of them were politicians. 6 of them would be what you call business or celebrities, business types or celebrities. 11 senators, 7 governors, 10 with others offices of the politicians. Of the 34, 8 of them are women, 26 are men. They're from 18 states, 4 from California, 3 from Massachusetts, 3 from New York, 3 from right here in Virginia. And Virginia is the only one where both senators and the current governor were listed, 2 from Minnesota. So if you're looking at it geographically, the Northeast, 11, the Midwest, 4, the South, 5, and the West, 8. Just some cool crosstabs on that.
Has there ever been, at this point in modern times, that many people who are in the mix?
Donald Trump has showed that anybody could be president of the United States. But even more importantly than that, I think as Democrats, we usually have a standard bearer. And Democrats, and one of the things that Democrats have a messiah complex, and we are very we're not a bottom up party. We are very much a top down party, and this theory sticks except for President Carter. But you look at the Kennedys, you look at the Clintons, you look at the Barack Obamas, and we're very personality driven. And so everybody's waiting on that next Barack Obama to come about, or that next person who has that skill set of Bill Clinton. And that person just ain't there. That's not going to happen. And so now you do have this wide array, this wide cast of characters. I interviewed Mark Cuban on my podcast, and Mark Cuban said, I'm considering running for president of the United States.
He's on the list.
Yeah, the list goes on and on and on and on. And so I think that finally you'll have something that's very healthy for the party, which is 20 people running for office from all parts of the country, all walks of life, bringing in different bases and different. It's going to be exciting to watch. It really will be.
Well, you got all these people running, Mark. Is this good? And they represent different visions of what the Democratic Party ought to be, right? It's not that there's a total agreement on where the party ought to stand on issues like health care or other things. Is it good for the party to have this wide open field and not? I think you'd be hard pressed to identify a front runner.
Yes, I think anybody would be very hard pressed to identify a front runner, except honestly, if Joe Biden runs, I think he will be the front runner. At least for a period of time. Why? Because he's the only one anyone's ever heard of. So that will make him the front runner. He's also got talent. I don't mean to diminish him in any way, but that's one reason that he will certainly be a front runner. But look, I think, going back to something that was said before, I think Donald Trump has given amateurs a bad name, at least among Democrats, to some extent among Republicans too. But we're seeing this real change in our polls. We often ask people whether they want a candidate who's got experience in government or someone who's been successful in the private sector. And it used to be both Democrats and Republicans said, we'd like someone who's been successful in the private sector over somebody who's like a professional politician. That has changed. It changed wholly among Democrats. Democrats almost all say, we want someone who has experience in government, not somebody from the private sector. But even Republicans and independents have moved meaningfully in that direction. So I think that the Mark Cubans, as talented as they may be in their own realms, I think they're going to have a hard selling job to do among Democrats. I think that while being a politician is not exactly the best calling card, strongest calling card with most Americans, with Democrats, having that kind of experience is going to be something that people actually value.
Can I say something else?
Yes.
So the Democratic Party is really old. And Joe Biden and a lot of these names, I don't want to delve into any questions you may have, will struggle to win because of the fact that they don't fall into what many Democrats are looking for, which is a new energy and a fresh face, which is why Elizabeth Warren, I mean, they'll have other issues, but why Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden will all struggle, I think, to get. They may start off, but they'll flame out eventually.
You know, we were talking backstage about the age of the people who define the Democratic Party at the moment. Elizabeth Warren's 71, Bernie Sanders is 74, Hillary Clinton is 70, Joe Biden is 74. He turns 75 next week. Nancy Pelosi is 77, Clyburn is 77, Hoyer is 78. Is this a problem, Mark?
Well, you know, I honestly don't think it is a big problem. It's maybe a problem for them. It's a problem for me. I'm getting older too. I wish I was remaining younger, but it's a problem I can't solve. A couple things are true. First of all, yes, these people are older. It's also true that the average Democratic primary voter is pretty much older too. So the reality is, in many states, close to half of the Democratic primary electorate is over 60. And in some places, you have a third or more that's over 70. So it's an older the primary electorate's an older electorate, point one. Point two, people are always say they're looking for some new, fresh face. The reality is they don't always get new, fresh faces. And the truth is, whoever they get on the Democratic side, with the possible exception of Joe Biden, is going to be a new and fresh face, if not a young face. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
But Clinton was under 50 when he was elected the first time, right? Obama was under 50 when he was elected the first time. So, in fact, you know, the Democrats, while it's true they have this, you know, older primary base, they have some pretty good track record of electing young, slightly unknown outsiders.
Well, I'm not suggesting that the Democrats don't want to elect a young person. I'm just saying I don't think they want to not elect an older person.
Right. I think that's also
Well,
true.
and also, I mean, but in contrast, the leadership of the Republican Party, but for Donald Trump, when people look at the bench, quote unquote bench of the Republican Party, you look at Nikki Haley, you look at Tim Scott, you look at Marco Rubio, you look at Ted Cruz. I mean, you're looking at a quote unquote bench in the future. People see the future in the Republican Party. That's my point.
And it's pretty diverse.
And it's very diverse.
You think it's a problem for Democrats, Glen?
I think what you're going to get is you're going to get sort of it coming down to different, as the saying goes, different lanes in the primary. And like in the Republican side, the lane used to be, 2016 changed it. We'll see if that, you'd have the kind of social conservative, you'd have the establishment choice, you'd have the economic conservative, and they would kind of vie. Whoever is the best out of those lanes would then vie for the nomination. I think this time you're more likely to have a young slot versus an old slot or lane, and I think Elizabeth Warren is going to be the most likely to come, down to the final couple, and in the younger slot, I think somebody like Cory Booker will be more likely. I think it's going to be very difficult for a white male to do well in the Democratic presidential primary.
So thinking not about who you think will get the nomination, because we're going to do that at the end, but who you think ought to be in the mix, maybe somebody that is not a well-known name, but someone you think is interesting and worth watching. Who would you, maybe start at the other end, who would you say this is somebody is worth keeping your eye on for the Democratic nomination?
Well, I'd say Javier Becerra, but he may be 6 or 8 years. It may not be 2020. It may be 2024. He's the Attorney General now in California. I think he probably has to be governor first, but he's somebody who I think is very ambitious, very smart, and just someone to keep your eye on, and very popular in the Democratic base.
Mark, who would be like somebody we don't all know about, or maybe haven't thought about, that you think is worth watching?
Well, there's a lot of people worth watching, including a lot of my clients. But look, I think there are several people. I'm going to mention 2 I think are not running this time, who happen to actually be white males. One is Seth Moulton from Massachusetts.
Seth's not running?
I don't think he is.
He's on my list.
He's been mentioned, and he's actually visited Iowa, so there's a sure sign, right? Brian Schatz from Hawaii we have
He's
not
not
had a
on my
president
list.
from Hawaii.
We have Barack Obama's from Hawaii.
Well, okay. We have never had a president who represented Hawaii. Let's put it that way. I thought it was from. In any event, Hawaii is definitely somewhat disconnected from the mainland, but Schatz is proving himself to be a young guy in his mid-30s, proving to be an extraordinary legislator on the one hand, and someone who is sort of getting people to stand up to Trump, but also working successfully with Republicans legislatively. So I think a very interesting guy for the future.
I would think that my favorite, although I don't, you're going to ask a question later about who will be the nominee. I don't think he will be the nominee, but I think he is the most talented, is Eric Garcetti, the mayor of L.A. Just an amazing character. He just passed on running for governor. He's actually, his consultant is the same consultant for Dianne Feinstein, so we know he's not running for United States Senate. She's running again. But I think he's amazing, and also a white male, actually, who would do very well, especially now when we're having this discussion, although he may be pigeonholed because he's somewhat of a one-issue senator, is Chris Murphy, who I think is very talented as well.
Glenn, looking at the other party, who do you think is interesting, worth watching?
I think in terms of long shots that are certainly, I think, have shown some political talent, Kamala Harris from California. So 3 of us mentioned people from California, which is base of the Democratic Party. And then another strong candidate, I think, for the future, it would be, speaking of Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard. Seems to get people, Democrats, going.
Why are you laughing?
Because
Syria.
Tulsi Gabbard doesn't get anybody.
Because of Syria.
Yeah, and she's pretty. Yes. No.
In other words, you hope she becomes.
Yeah. No.
Well, she is worth watching. Apparently, the NSA's been watching her for a while. They're a little concerned.
Well, if you go meet with Bashar al-Assad, you deserve to be watched.
That's basically the theory.
I have my motives.
The reason that 156 people are running for the Democratic nomination is because it seems like it's going to be worth having. Donald Trump seems to be in some considerable peril. How could Democrats screw this up?
We screw up a lot, so I mean that's not anything.
Count the ways.
What could Democrats do so that this very nice scenario a lot of Democrats have of defeating Donald Trump for a second term doesn't come true?
We could relitigate 2016, which a lot of my colleagues are having a great job screwing up now doing. I mean, this whole Bernie versus Hillary thing is driving me insane. I really don't care to relitigate that. I think that's kind of consumed a lot of what we're doing in our party.
And there's some sort of vote coming up next week, right, on nomination rules and proceedings?
Yeah, it's a vote for the Unity Commission or something. I mean, it is what it is. I tend not to try to waste bandwidth on having those same debates. I think if we don't focus on what got us this far, I think if we don't focus on what's gotten us electoral victories in the past, then we will screw this up. I think that one of the most amazing things is that millennial voters, you saw an uptick across all races of millennial voters except African-American millennials. I think the base of the party are women of color. I think that's been proven time and time again. In fact, you just saw it again in Virginia. And so I think that you're also having this interesting discussion between certain facets of our party, the Joe Bidens and others who are searching for this or scratching for the ghost of the working class voter instead of building a party for what is a new electorate.
So the focus should be not on winning back the Trump voters, but on energizing millennials, people of color, the more diverse electorate that's coming. That ought to be the focus of the
Yeah, I firmly believe so, because I said this earlier, I'll say it again. I think some of those voters you lost, the majority of those voters you lost, they weren't economic anxiety voters anyway.
They were.
Cultural anxiety, and they weren't, this is what drives me crazy about the media. CNN does it, so I'm part of the problem, but Washington Post, USA Today, and everybody, they go and they do these exposés where they go sit and they find this like unicorn, which is the Trump-Obama voter, and then they follow them around for like weeks and months to see how they feel about the wind, and then they like, are you eating the same thing you ate before Donald Trump was president? And I'm like, you're killing me here, guys. I mean, that's not a large thing, and that doesn't change the political spectrum I don't believe.
But I think Democrats also, the danger, the biggest danger for Democrats is that they are only the anti-Trump party. Like if the Democrats have their sales pitch, what the better deal, better jobs, better wages, better whatever that thing was that they rolled out was a mess. It was a messaging disaster. It's like, the danger is don't talk about Donald Trump. Everybody knows about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's going to be talking about Donald Trump, so you can just shut up about him, right? Let him make his case about who Donald Trump is. You need to make a case about what it is you are bringing to the table that is exciting, is interesting, is new, is different, and engages people and connects with people. People want to vote for someone kind of like them.
Yeah, that's kind of what Doug Moore is doing. He's not talking about Roy Moore.
Doug Jones.
Doug Jones. Yes. He's not talking about Roy Moore. I'm sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
I just want to make 3 quick points. First, what you say is absolutely true, but, and there's an important but here, the only way one can win a Democratic primary for almost any office, at least these days, it may change by the time we get to 2020, is by being the anti-Trump. So you're going to hear a lot of Democrats attacking Trump because their first race they have to win is the primary, not the general election. So give them a break there, maybe, for a few months at least. Second, I must say, I think this debate between sort of energizing the rising American electorate, as we call it, or trying to get back Trump voters, I think it is a sort of false and sterile debate. The truth is we need to do both. And we can do both, and they are not mutually exclusive in any way, shape, or form. And the biggest mistake we can make, as far as I'm concerned, is to treat them as mutually exclusive. That would be a real error. But, point 3, while there are, an almost infinite number of ways Democrats could screw up, the most important variable in 2020 is going to be Donald Trump. The most important thing that's going to determine whether or not Democrats win or lose in 2020 is Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And if Donald Trump gets his act together in some way and moves, makes progress in the world and in the country, that will make it much harder for us to win. And if he continues being an ass, it's going to be a lot easier for us to win.
I think that if the Democrats take control of the House and the base and a bunch of their members push for impeachment of Trump, and it won't go anywhere in the Senate, I think that kind of triangulation, kind of like what Clinton did in 96, not in 95, 96, not the same as Trump, but I think Trump could play off of that a bit, if he's adroit enough to do so.
I don't know if Donald Trump can triangulate, though.
He does. He spent plenty of energy attacking Republican leadership, and once he, even though he loves Nancy and Chuck, as he calls them, once they start trying to impeach him, he'll have a different opinion. So,
do you think Democrats will win control of the House next year?
I said if.
Yeah, I know you said if. And now I'm asking you a follow-up question. This would be a kind of a journalistic thing. Will they?
They certainly have a chance.
Will they, Bakari?
Before last Tuesday, I was a wholehearted no. After last Tuesday, I give us like a 20% chance.
Mark, Democrats going to take the House?
I think the odds are better than even.
Paul, what do you think?
I don't think so. I don't think there's enough swing seats. It's going to be very close. The Republicans are going to lose most of their majority, but not all of it. It'll still be probably a 5, I'd say 5, 7
There are
seat
enough
majority.
swing seats. We would just have to run a inside straight flush and not lose anything.
Like, I mean, even John Katko, like there's a Republican in upstate New York, John Katko, a terrific Republican congressperson who's doing a nice job running as a Republican in a Democratic state and doesn't appear to have a Democratic opponent at all, right? So, I mean, the Democrats have to run the table even in places where at the moment they don't have anybody on the field at all.
We're talking as though this is going to be a two-way race in 2020. Do you think that's the case, or do you think there's going to be a credible kind of third alternative? Because if you want to look at the ways Donald Trump could win with just a core of support of 35 or 38%, it's if you've got a credible additional candidate in there. Bernie Sanders, for instance, or somebody else. Do you think this will be a three-way race like we've seen every once in a while in modern times, like 92 and 96, or is it going to be more of a traditional two-way race?
I think it's a four-way race, but it's in the two parties. It's the independents in the Democratic Party. It's the Trumpists in the Republican Party. That's where the war goes on. I still don't see the structural barriers to a third-party candidate getting on the ballot and making a significant difference is so high, you need Mark Cuban or someone like him to drop $1 billion in the process starting next year to buy access to get on the ballots. And like Ross Perot did. And even then, he didn't win, but he helped Bill Clinton win.
No, but you can have an impact. Do you think it's a two-way race?
Well, so let me divide two things. Is a third-party candidate going to win?
No.
Almost certainly not. Could a third-party candidate have an influence? The answer is absolutely yes. I don't happen to buy this, but there are people who would argue. I'll tell you the fact. The fact is that in the states, the sort of Democratic states that Hillary Clinton lost,
Jill Stein got more votes.
Jill Stein got more votes in every one of those states than the margin.
Except Pennsylvania. But
so the reality is, could they have an impact? Absolutely. Are they going to be president? Absolutely not.
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, and people look at Ross Perot, but they forget about Jill Stein. I mean, I think the margin in Wisconsin was 10,000 and some odd votes. Take away the fact that the biggest vote suppressor we've ever had in the history of this country is Scott Walker and how many people he kicked off the ballot, et cetera, et cetera. You also have Jill Stein, who got 49,000 votes in Wisconsin. You look at Michigan, where it was a 30,000 vote total, and Jill Stein got 60,000 votes. Now, are all of those people going to vote? Are all of those people going to turn out for Hillary Clinton? We don't know the answer to that. But if they do vote for somebody else, they're not voting for those aren't Donald Trump voters.
I remember a special election back in 1998 in New Mexico. The Republican, Heather Wilson, who's now Secretary of the Air Force, won, but with less than 50% of the vote. And there was a Green Party candidate who got enough votes that if that candidate's voters had voted for Phil Maloof, the Democrat, Maloof would have won. The only problem with that is when you looked at, and I don't remember the Green Party candidate's name, when you looked at their voters, Maloof's image was worse than Heather's image was among those voters. Maloof had like a 2 favorable, 93 unfavorable. And she wasn't a lot better. She was at 588. But the point being, Jill Stein's voters, they didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton or else they would have. So, that part of it, you can look at that and do the math lots of different times, lots of different elections. But third-party voters, they don't like the two parties. And they don't like the two-party candidates. And some of them a lot of them might be Democrats who were disaffected by Hillary Clinton, but they weren't ever going to vote for her. So I do agree with you that they probably wouldn't have turned out if there was nobody else on the ballot.
Yeah, my point is only, as I said, I don't buy that theory either, but could that person have an impact, that third party getting a small number of votes? The answer is yes.
And by the way, I'm sorry, one last thing. Ross Perot didn't cost George H.W.
Right.
the election in 1992. People wanted a change, and they were not going to reelect Bush. All it did was keep Clinton's numbers down. They weren't thrilled with Clinton if they voted for Perot, but it kept his margin of victory down, which helped Republicans in 92 do fine in the House and in the Senate, not suffer, and be ready, poised for a big comeback in 94.
That's true when you look at the voting returns that year. But if you looked at the course of the election, he did have an effect on the way the debate went and unnerving Bush. And I mean, there are impacts, it seemed to me, he had on the course of the election that aren't necessarily reflected in the vote he got at the end. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I'm not 100% sure that without Perot there, George H.W. Bush would have had a sparkling debate anyhow. Yeah. No. How much time do we have left?
So often there's but I think usually there's an issue that is the most important issue in a presidential race. And one year it was health care, and 1 year it was the Iraq War. What do you think is going to be the most powerful issue for 2020?
They've already said it, Trump.
No.
Okay, well, Mark already said it.
Yeah, no.
Unless you think Trump is a defining issue in which you could choose that. But I wonder if you think there's a substantive
No.
issue.
I think that the polls have bared that out. I mean, we looked at the exit polls from Virginia, and voters who turned out in this election 2 weeks ago said the number one issue was health care. I mean, over a third of the voters who turned out said that their number one issue was health care. I mean, it was a remarkable statistic. So I don't see any reason why that would change in 2018. I can't talk about 2020.
Well, that's right. 2020,
But
it's impossible. There's no way. I mean,
I don't know what that issue is going to be.
Right.
We could be at war with North Korea.
Exactly, and that's the problem. Any of this kind of projection is that healthcare was the most powerful voting issue in this election, in this year, in the middle of a debate about healthcare in Congress. So I think the easiest thing, and I don't mean to say easiest like, take the simple route. I mean, Donald Trump obviously will weigh over this election. The question is, what issue between now and then? If we're at war with North Korea, that's probably number one. Right?
Yeah. So
one would think, but I would just argue honestly that while we can always ask people a question about what's the most important issue, and we will always get an issue that is more important than the other issues, almost never is that actually the decisive fact about the election.
Yeah.
what's the decisive fact about the election usually?
Well, it's usually something about the candidate, something about the times in which they're living, and something about the relationship between the two. And we sort of have the dialogue through issues because that's the way we're supposed to have political dialogues. But the issues are illustrating something larger about the parties and the candidates. They're not just people saying, well, I read your health care plan and I like it a lot better than your health care plan, therefore I'm voting for you. I don't think that's what happened in Virginia, even though the exit polls say health care most important issue, and I don't think it's what happens in very many elections.
So Bakari has to go catch a plane, so let's not let him get away without the lightning round final question, and then we'll talk some more, which is, who's the Democratic nominee in 2020? And since you're leaving, you have to go first. Not who you want.
No. I think that the front runner, when she announces for President of the United States, is Kamala Harris, and I think that you probably have Eric Holder running a very close second.
Huh. Interesting, yeah. Mark, who's the Democratic nominee?
Okay, well, so I majored in cowardice. I'm happy to be a coward, but to avoid that label, I just want to retreat into probabilities for a second. So who's likely to be? This person who has the single greatest likelihood of being the Democratic nominee, I would say, is Joe Biden. The likelihood that he will be the nominee is actually pretty small, but it's still greater likelihood than any other individual has.
Well, I interviewed him Sunday, and he's definitely running, if you were curious. Yeah.
I'm going to take Amy Klobuchar for 1,000. And I pick Amy Klobuchar because I think it's going to be a woman.
He also picked Carly Fiorina, I learned.
I picked Klobuchar largely as sort of representing a class. She is a middle flyover country kind of person. She is a very nice and charming person. She is a woman, which is good for the Democratic Party, and she has good progressive credentials. So I say Klobuchar.
So, Glen, not who you want to be the Democratic nominee.
That's Al Franken.
Yeah. Only as of today.
As of today.
Yes. There's been a little scandal with Al Franken today, in case you've been otherwise engaged. Glen, who do you think is the most likely Democratic nominee in 2020?
I think that it won't be Bernie Sanders, but I think it will be Bernie Sanders light, and that's Elizabeth Warren, because I think that side of the party feels energized, and Hillary Clinton beat Bernie because she survived him, but there's a lot of energy on that side of the Democratic Party.
Thanks very much. Let's give him a hand.
Good to see you. See you later. Good to see you. Take care. All the best.
So,
We'll talk soon.
thanks very much. Nice to see you. So I wonder if any of you have questions that you'd like to pose to the panel about 2020 or about politics or other things. Does anyone have a question that you are dying to raise? So we're looking for one comment that was made about previous questioners, and I was not here, was that they made statements of policy rather than ask questions. So the only thing we would ask is that whatever sentence you say has to end with a question mark. Do you want to wait and think about that? We'll come to you second, but remember, pose it as you need to ask a question. Thank you.
What do you believe the outcome is going to be of the Mueller investigation?
So who would like to respond to that?
Go ahead.
I'm not now, nor have I ever been an attorney, nor an FBI agent. So I can't really tell you exactly, but I think, let's put it this way, I think on the face of it, it is pretty clearly evident by my reading that major figures in the Trump campaign violated the campaign finance laws. One is not allowed to solicit or receive anything of value from a foreign individual or entity. Okay? I think it's sort of flat out clear that that happened. So that is a violation of the campaign finance laws. Did Donald Trump do that? Well, I would argue he did very publicly. He said, Russia, please do something. Please give me something of value. By my lights, that is soliciting a thing of value from a foreign entity. Okay? It meets the definition completely. However, I don't think the president's going to be indicted. I do think there are going to be a lot more indictments on a lot of charges of various other people pretty close to him.
I think Manafort is obviously the biggest problem. That the money problem for Manafort goes very, very deep into all of these foreign bank accounts, and any good investigator can just have all kinds of fun there. So I think there'll be a bunch of indictments related to money laundering and stuff that may not have anything to do with the campaign, all of which will be a stain on Donald Trump. And the problem for Trump is that it makes him crazy on Twitter. It just makes him mad. And so who knows what woodchuck hole he'll step in on Twitter. I mean, he's making an obstruction case on Twitter when he's basically accuses witnesses in this case of being liars publicly. It's very challenging.
I think Mike Glen's a bigger problem than Paul Manafort because it gets closer to the actual campaign in the White House. Mark, what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, if I was able to find a client who's willing to pay me $70 million, I would be more than happy to give the IRS their $35 million free and clear. No, I'd celebrate my check to the IRS for $35 million.
Glen, what do you think the outcome of the Mueller investigation is going to be?
Well, I like Mark, I prefer to be a pollster, not an attorney. And I will say this about, so I don't really know enough about what's going on in that. The FBI, and I know this may shock everybody, but the FBI doesn't usually call me and give me briefings to update me on what's going on. But I will add this note about Paul Manafort. Back in the mid-'80s, when I first got into politics, there was a powerhouse lobbying kind of public affairs firm, I guess you'd call it now, called Black, Manafort, and Stone. And it was Charlie Black, Paul Manafort, and Roger Stone, which, by the way, if you haven't seen the documentary on Stone, it's kind of entertaining, and you also feel like taking a shower afterwards because it's a little, off-putting. But back in the day, it was like, well, if you got to deal with anybody from that firm, Charlie Black is the honest, trustworthy one, and the other two, you can't trust them at all. And I think I got to admit, when Manafort came into the Trump campaign, and I heard that, I was like, oh my God! I figured he was long gone, and nope, he had to come back and be sleazy again.
Okay, then, have you ever been in a campaign where a foreign government offered to help you out with negative research?
No.
Have you, Mark?
No.
No. And what if you had been in a meeting and somebody said, like the candidate's son said, hey, Russia's offering to give us some dirt on our opponent? What would happen in the campaigns you've been in?
It's really an excellent question. I've thought about it a lot. And, of course, I would love to believe that I would have stood up and said, this is outrageous. We couldn't possibly take such a meeting. It would be a criminal violation. It would be immoral. But I'm honestly not sure, to tell you the truth, what would have happened.
Because in the flow of a campaign, you're caught up in everything. And
yes, yes.
That's
and
pretty honest
people
answer.
do walk in all the time with all kinds of. I don't want to mention names here, but in a campaign I was involved in, a general, someone whose first name was General, because they had that title, came in and said, we must have an urgent meeting of the senior staff immediately. I have news that will be absolutely essential. It will change the whole face of the campaign. One country is about to bomb another country. I don't want to get into the names here, but we're going to be on the verge of World War III. Okay? And I know this because a person who was like the assistant consul general in Houston for some guy told me this. Okay? Like, this is craziness. And this is not negative information, but I'm just saying people always come in with these crazy notions, even people who are considered fairly sane and have sort of responsible positions, and sometimes they're actually taken seriously.
Did you have a meeting about World War III that was about to start? Or?
Yeah, we didn't. We had that was the meeting. It was about to hear that the World War III was about to start, and he wanted to know what we are planning to do about it.
Which side to be on. Yeah. Can I say, there are some vagaries here that I want to give some credit to, particularly the Trump campaign. So I was investigating for an extended period of time Turkish money in American politics, particularly the Glen movement, which had made a whole bunch of illegal donations to congressional campaigns, and also had made a bunch of illegal donations, it turns out, to Hillary Clinton's campaign, which is sort of interesting. And Mr. Glen, the leader of this movement, lives in Pennsylvania. He has a compound up there, and the primary interest for the Turkish government these days in foreign policy is getting Glen back to Turkey so they can execute him, basically. They accuse him of running a coup attempt in Turkey against the current government. Well, in reporting that story, which had political implications for both campaigns, particularly for the Hillary Clinton campaign, I was in consultation with Turks, right? And I called the Turkish government for information. So was I involved in taking foreign information, opposition research you might call it, to help damage Hillary Clinton's campaign? Was it the Turkish government that helped me confirm that the guy they were accusing of running the coup in their country on the ground there was a secret illegal Hillary Clinton donor, which is the story that I wrote? So, again, I'm not forgiving anything that they did in the Trump campaign. I'm saying that there are places in this world that I live in where I gather political information on candidates, and some of it might come from a foreign government. How do we feel about that?
At least you weren't trying to kidnap Glen while you were the national security advisor to the president.
I was not, and I really do believe the Turkish money is going to be the bottom of all this, but that's only because I have a particular interest.
Glen, what would have happened in a campaign you were in if this had happened?
That's a good question, because Mark, a couple observations. Mark's exactly right, which is every campaign, it seems, has, there's somebody who comes in and says, I've got the goods on your opponent, and of course it turns out to be nothing, or the same person with the same name, and it's not that person, because, our candidate never lived in Seattle. Our opponent never lived in Seattle, or, whatever it is, or they've got the secret, issue that's going to win it, or inside information on World War III, in which case, had I known that, Mark, I would have shorted everything. So next time you hear about World War III, let me know. I also, I agree with Mark. You feel like you hope you would stand up and say, that's illegal, I'm out of here. Would you know that was the law at the time? Or is the law? I don't know. I do have a saying that I firmly believe, and most people who do what we do believes, and it's something I try and teach younger people who are just getting into politics, which is, I don't wear orange for anyone. And the point is, don't ever break campaign law. It just is not worth it to go to jail for a candidate or what you think is the right thing. Don't go out and tear down campaign signs. That's not against the law. Well, maybe it is, but you just don't do stuff like that. You either win on your merits, and you can argue about whether those, merits are the right ones or the wrong ones. That's fine, but don't break the law. It's just not worth going to jail for. And I know people who have gone to jail for breaking the law. The good news is the one person I know who did that was somebody that, after associating with them for a brief period of time on a campaign, when they got fired from that one, this happened years ago before they got in the trouble, it's like, never get that person involved in a campaign I'm working on again.
Let's see. Now, would you like to ask a question?
Well, first of all, I'd like to make an observation, and that is, I find personally that this panel has been most impressive, enlightening, and energizing. I think you've been great.
Well, in that case, you don't have to have a question.
Anybody else who wants to add that observation?
My question is, how great are you?
So, as far as the other thing is concerned, in regards to the Democratic, we're talking about someone leading the Democratic Party in the national, as far as a presidential candidate. Couldn't it possibly be, it doesn't have to be from the old establishment, couldn't we see somebody probably surface who could be a young Bakari Sellers or somebody that would probably really surprise us? Not impossible?
Not at all impossible. In fact, I think, nobody knew who Bill Clinton was either. There is, and for that matter, nobody knew who Jimmy Carter was, right? Lightning in a bottle. Part of the magic of this, and I always joke about the campaigns are, like 30% strategy, 30% message, and 30% magic. And it's the magic part that none of us can foresee and know who is going to do. None of us even thought Ross Perot. We thought Ross Perot was kind of a joke. Look under the hood and fix it. But he launched a national party, the Reform Party, that spent 20 years goofing around American politics. So, yeah, it could be somebody we've never heard of. We don't, that's the magic part.
Remember, Jimmy Carter, his slogan, the reason he won the Democratic nomination and ultimately the presidency was, "I will never lie to you." Well, in 2020, a Democrat could catch fire in the primary saying, "I will never tweet in the early morning at you."
Well, but I do guess if it's 30-30-30, then the 10% is who you hire as your pollster, I guess.
Yeah, right. No,
but look, I think it's not only possible that somebody like that will merge, I think it's likely. As I said before, the single greatest likelihood, you got to give it to somebody who's already known. But if you sort of add up all the likelihoods of the people you don't know, by far the greatest likelihood is someone whose name we are not really, is not on the tip of anyone's tongue today, is going to be that nominee.
And I just want to mention, by the way, that if, in fact, there is a 17, 18, 19-person field of serious candidates in the Democratic Party, and if Donald Trump decides not to run for re-election, it is going to be a banner year. I mean, banner year for pollsters and consultants. It's going to be...
Oh, darn.
I mean, 2020 is going to be a, $10 billion campaign year.
Well, I wonder... we talk about Jimmy Carter, for instance, as somebody who came out of nowhere, but he worked very methodically there for years in advance, laying the groundwork for his successful campaign. Are you already fielding queries and requests from people who want to run? Harder for you, Glen, because it'd be a challenge. But anyway, maybe you are. But Mark, are you getting like lots of queries from people who are trying to book you for 2020?
No, people are not really at that point yet. People don't want to have consulting teams. People are not that far forward with it yet. But what Jimmy Carter had that's really different, first of all, he had a team around him of people who were his Georgia people. Ham Jordan, Jody Powell. These were people who were Jimmy Carter people. They didn't work for anybody else ever, before or after. Sure, they were Jimmy Carter people, and they were his people in Georgia, and that was it. He eventually added some others, but that was the core team for a long time. Second, he took a lot of positions, institutional positions, like chairman of the Democratic Governors Association, that lots of other people have had and tried to use that position, most of them unsuccessfully, to advance themselves. And obviously you can look at anybody who's, been president of the DGA or been the head of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee or the House Campaign Committee and say, they're after the fact and say this was part of their methodical preparation. And it may have been part of their methodical preparation, as it certainly was for Carter. But the truth is, very rarely does that methodical preparation pay off. Sometimes it does.
So it doesn't guarantee that you'll get anywhere, but I wonder if it's necessary, even at this point, to be doing something methodical. Is it possible the lightning will strike you and it hadn't occurred to you in a year from now?
No, sorry. Here's what I'm trying to say, is you may not have...
Yes, I understand what you're saying. I'm asking something else. So you can
you have to be doing something.
Now it's past time to start laying the groundwork if you're planning.
Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean hiring a consulting team. It doesn't necessarily mean occupying a position of influence in some party entity or whatever.
Deleting your Facebook page now.
Yeah. Glen, do you agree with that if you're running for president, at this point you're already running for president even if you haven't told anyone or hired anyone?
Right. Remember the old saying about the Senate. Every day more than half of them wake up, look in the mirror, and say, "I should be president." So yes, I think that you're preparing different ways. One is you're testing out your potential themes and messages in speeches and in talks with people and seeing, kind of road testing those. Secondly, you're talking to potential big money people. Kind of on the QT, maybe not even saying I'm running for president, but I doubt that many of those are too surprised that, you would end up running for president, but you have to kind of gauge you have to do a little dance with them so that they're more inclined to support you. You're also talking to party leadership in random states like Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Florida, So, you're starting to kind of, how can I help? What can I do to campaign for your candidates? Those sorts of things. So, but Mark's totally right, which is you're not doing, significant early polling. You got a lot more to do before you start doing that.
And in the social media age, you're also building up your Facebook page, your Twitter following, all those kinds of things. But the thing is that you can do all these things, and you should do all these things anyway. So if you're running for re-election in the United States Senate at some point in the next 6 years, you should be doing all the things that Glen just talked about. So it's very hard to distinguish between the people who are doing it because they're running for re-election or running for the Senate or whatever, and people who are doing it because they plan to run for president.
So we're about to hit the 1 hour mark, and I have a final question. Does somebody have a question that you're just trying to ask?
Yes, I'm trying.
Okay.
David Brooks wrote a column recently in which he cited some research that said the analysis we should be looking at is somewheres versus anywheres, not the rural-urban split we always hear about. The somewheres can work anywhere. They're the computer people, they can move around each or whatever. Not the anywheres. The somewheres are pretty much tied to where they are by reason of environment, resources, whatever. Does that analysis make sense to you, and as opposed to the urban-rural split to explain voting outcomes? Repeat the question.
Well, the question was whether you can divide voters instead of by urban and rural as the sort of somewheres, that is, people tied for whatever reason, particularly I'm assuming economic reasons, to a geographic location, versus the sort of more gig economy, younger era people who are more flexible and can move around.
And this was a David Brooks column in the New York Times. Yeah.
It wasn't his idea. He was citing a
Right.
researcher.
So you all look perplexed, so I'm thinking maybe you don't endorse this idea. What do you think?
Well,
Ask the pollsters. I mean, you can slice the voters any way you want.
that's right. That's exactly the point. You can slice voters in a lot of different ways, and they're going to come out the same way. I mean, you're going to find the divisions. So if you look at voting behavior by urban and rural and urban, and you don't see a difference, you need a better pair of glasses and a better set of pronunciation. It's clearly there. It's evident. Okay. Can you divide people by education? People with postgraduate educations, people with graduate college degrees, people without college degrees, and see big differences? Absolutely you can. Can you divide them by people who are anywheres or somewheres and see differences? Yes, you can. The question is, what's really driving those differences? And the truth is, for the most part, it is not the somewhere versus anywhere. It is not the urban versus rural. It's not education per se. It's things that happen in the culture that those people live in. And that's really it's an underlying factor that happens to be the same across some of those dimensions. That's really what's ultimately important, I think. But there are lots of ways to divide up the electorate, and none of them are magic, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there's a lot more people who vote consistently for Democrats than there are anywheres. You know, when you add up the total number of anywheres in the country, I mean, it's an interesting, I'd never heard that. I try and read a lot. I haven't seen the David Brooks column. I guess I got to now, and because it's interesting. But there's a lot more core Democratic voters than there are people who can work anywheres.
And I just add, like, a lot of these terms that we throw around that mean something to us, they don't necessarily mean anything to people. We went to Silicon Valley, okay, and asked about the gig economy. Nobody knew what we were talking about, okay? Never heard of it before. Okay, in Silicon Valley, like regular voters, never heard of it.
So here's our parting question. 2016 was a really interesting election. I personally did not look so smart when the results came in. I'm wondering if
to me you did.
Yeah, I wonder if what do you think the big lesson is from 2016? What is the thing that we should have learned from this very interesting and surprising election that we just had? Glen, do you want to go?
Sure. The American people's desire for change is a constant. When you look at the exit polls, much more so than any single issue, it was people who wanted change voted overwhelmingly for Trump. Just like in 2008, people who wanted change voted overwhelmingly for Obama. There are some continuation elections. 2012 was a continuation election. 1984 was a continuation election. To some extent, 1988 was as well. 1996 was. But if you look particularly at midterms, change is what's much more constant. So if you're on the wrong side of a change election, your party is in big trouble. And I think that's what happened to the Democrats in 2016, and something that it's a pendulum in American politics, and it swings both ways. And 2018, it's more likely to be a change that favors the Democrats.
Mark, what's the lesson that you think we should remember from 2016?
Well, a couple. First of all, just to give you a perspective on, I agree with everything Glen just said about change. It's also true that the people who are most opposed to change voted for Trump, and the people who are for change voted for Clinton. So, again, you have to change. What does that mean? What do we mean by change? Being much more specific about, concrete about these things matters because, again, you can get easily confused, which is one thing we should learn. Second thing we should learn is modesty, which is, sometimes what you think is going to happen isn't going to happen. Third, low probability events do happen. People kept saying, oh my God, Nate Silver was totally wrong. He said Clinton was going to win. Well, he said actually Trump had a 30% chance of winning. 30% events happen all the time. In fact, they happen about 30% of the time, oddly enough. And so, rare events do happen. And that 30% is not even so rare. Finally, I think we have to recognize that bigger forces are at play here than the day-to-day ins and outs of the campaign. And while we and the press and the political cognoscenti focus on the day-to-day sort of machinations of what's happening, the truth is a lot of this is worked out by much bigger forces than that. And we got to pay attention to those bigger forces, not just the day-to-day.
Well, what lesson do you take?
Yeah, what I took away from this is that I underestimated in my mathematics the percentage of impact of magic. That in fact and this is what you mean about sort of the larger forces. And I remind myself every day, because I get to put something in the front page of the newspaper every day, how wrong I am about what people actually care about. Because I put the story on the front page, I think everyone's going to pick this thing up and run with it. It's a great story, and it drops to the bottom of the well. But this week we got 4 million page views off of some teenage girl who shot an elk. She thought she was shooting a deer. She shot an elk.
I was one of those page views.
I was just like everybody. Again, something I totally missed. There was something magic about this that I couldn't predict that people were going to want to look at the elk story, and we had nothing to do with the elk story. It's this, we have to figure out as political sort of observers, we have to keep our ears open for magic and not dismiss it as quickly. I mean, I sat on the back porch, my neighbor over here, I have a house in Madison, and we drank Miller Lite, and he told me that Eric Cantor was going to lose the election in a primary, and I told him he was out of his mind. But he had been at a local Republican gathering where Eric Cantor's slate of local officials all got axed by a bunch of Tea Party rowdies. So he smelled the magic. And I was sitting in my office in D.C. I was like, hey, you're out of your mind, but give me another beer. So that's part of what I've learned is, have another beer and give more credit to the magic.
More beer, more magic. I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel.
Just wanted to thank everyone for coming and our great panels today. And just wanted to deliver a thank you from Professor Sabato, too. He got pulled away. But again, thank you so much for coming and making this, I think, a very good day.